Hey everyone, this is Zan, and welcome to Dominion 6 at a glance, featuring Sauromatia, the Amazon Queens. This nation features many cavalry and archers, strong death and nature magic, and access to water, blood, and astral magic. They can recruit hydras and tight rein leaders from their capital, and have the option to choose between a strong, sacred cavalry focused build or a complete scales build. Saurmatia's unit roster features composite bow archers recruitable in any fort, as well as poison bow archers recruitable only in the capital. They're more known for their broader way of cavalry, featuring heavily armored lancers from your forts, and specific horse archers using the new mobile archer feature. Now, all of these human units do feature some sort of tattoo that, when awakened with a specific spell, will give each unit limited invulnerability and a random stat depending on the tattoo. Notably, the horses themselves do not have these tattoos, and also have very low magic resistance, something to keep in mind. The nation has access to hydras and a very unique way to use them, which I'll expand on later, as well as two options of sacred cavalry. Sauromatia features a unique commander roster. Now, one of those unique mages is going to be the Soothsayer, so they have a chance to not even know magic, which means that you don't need a mage around to build a lab for them. Actually, once you construct a fort, you can immediately start recruiting them and they will construct their own lab. Now, the other 10% that don't know magic, well, they're set on fire, so I'm sure you'll find a similar use. Their commander lineup is actually pretty good in that they all have high mat move, they're all well armored, and they have decent leadership. Notably, the Manflayer and the Warrior Queen actually have a +2 morale bonus to the units under them. Now, their actual any fort mages, they have the Spirit Guide, which is an inexpensive researcher and reanimation spammer, the Inari, which has abysmally low morale but very consistently good magic paths that you can do some neat tricks with. The Warrior Sorceress is more of your random magic skill off-path mage. They can thug, they can cast very important battlefield spells, and most of the time they might even just be casting Blessing or Awaken Tattoos. Into their capital, they have the Hydra Tamer, which is one of the ways that players have a lot of skill expression using the tight rein ability, allowing undisciplined units to actually follow orders. And the Witch King, which is a fantastic capital-only mage. You can never really get enough of these because they can do it all. They can cast very powerful spells, they can random into very useful paths, they can solo thug provinces once you have enough research, come with their own fear aura, are fantastic leaders. You'll never get enough of these guys. Sauromatia's national summons honestly don't impact the game too much, and I would recommend avoiding them. Their non-national summons is where the meat of it's going to be, because the nation features a lot of cavalry units with low magic resistance on their horses, and that can be issued later in the game. They also feature a lot of ways of getting poison onto their enemy, but with worries of friendly fire, be it the archers or the hydras. So for the non-national summons, I found myself using the Shade Beasts a lot, because you can summon a lot of them. They're all ethereal, they all have magical weapons, they're poison and cold resistant, they're amphibious, and notably they are not spirit form, meaning you can actually buff their protection higher than 3, which is kind of useful, especially if you do like Stygian Reigns, which they ignore because they have magic weapons. And they also have dark power, and you can boost them up that way as well. Eventually, you'll phase them out and move toward whites, which are a lot better in every way, but obviously a lot more expensive and harder to mass. For the nature gems, I liked using a lot of mandragoras. Again, poison resistant, and they provide the sleep vine threat vector that maybe an opponent is not expecting from you. But I also used a lot of lamias for the same reasons of them being poison resistant, they have high regeneration, high magic resistance. Again, you just need to buff up their protection. And then I have Leogryphs listed here because, again, you do have access to Tight Rein, which means all of those really good but undisciplined summons, if you give leadership items to your Hydra Tamers, you can actually find ways to do some cool strategies with them. So me personally, I like the Leogryphs a lot because they did have really good stats. They're not poison resistant, so maybe they won't last as long as the Mandragoras or the Lamias would, but you get a lot of them, they're fairly strong, and once you can actually lead them properly, they are pretty good. But it's just an example. Really, you can do any summon here. And so this leads us to the combined roster. I think you should absolutely use the composite bow archers when and where you can. They're very, very strong in the early age, especially. The poison bows, maybe you can skip out on them until later in the game because the friendly fire can be very debilitating, especially on horses and mounts, of which, these are your standout units, right? They have the high mat move, they're great raiders, they can actually use the raid command, which is thematic as heck. But the standout was going to be the Sauromatian Cataphract, very high defense skill. For the early age, very high damaging attacks with the broadswords. They can be made limited. They can be given limited invulnerability and more stats still. The problem is they and the rest of the roster have human magic resistance of 10, and their mounts tend to have, 4 to 6, which is really, really bad as the game progresses, not only because your enemy might start trying to abuse this weakness, but also if you want to use any sort of death evocations, which, you have really good death mages, the friendly fire is going to be extraordinary because a lot of death evocations target magic resistance. And so, as the game progresses, you do want to start phasing out your mounted units from your primary armies. You can still use them to raid, but for your big major engagements, I think, and this is how I played this nation, you should start leaning toward your non-national summons. I had the majority of my army by turn 50, 60 was comprised of Shade Beast, Whites, Lamias, and Mandragoras, almost entirely. I sprinkled in a few other undisciplined units here and there, like Giants, Leogryphs, Mantises, just to see what I could do with Hydra Tamers. Now, as you do this transition and your army becomes more and more poison resistant, they have magic weapons, you can actually start adding in your Hydras again, because the Poison Cloud won't affect the undead very much, and they're still pretty useful. They have high magic resistance. And yes, they are susceptible to fire, but you can kind of buff this a little bit, and Firestorm's not going to be the biggest of deals because they can still regenerate, but something you should still worry about. And then your Sacreds. Personally, I like the Orpata better. They're a more general use Sacred. Notably that their map move is 16 as opposed to the rest of your cavalry, which is 20, and that can be annoying sometimes. The Androphags I did find a use for in that I could send them underwater because of the swimming ability and also that they could cross rivers. So they're more of a specialist unit depending on your terrain. Other than that, I probably wouldn't recruit too many of these. Now, the mages can both support the units with body ethereal and nature magic, but mostly you're here to cast big death magic, which, once you get to the part of the game where you're casting death magic, it's not compatible with your normal roster. You have to be on that summoned roster I gave you. Until then, you can focus on a lot of astral and nature magic with your Inaris and your Jade Sorceresses. And so, moving on to your spell recommendations, I'll start with a few death spells. Shadow Blast is very good, even for a gem, especially now that it does half damage as a minimum and can still paralyze. Horde of Skeletons is a timeless classic. They only have a little bit of issue keeping up with your cavalry, but they're better later. Body Ethereal and Awakened Tattoos are going to be some of your premier spells to actually buff up your units and make them more resistant to the enemy. As you progress in the game and you start adding in those non-national summons I've mentioned, you can start doing some invulnerability, you can do bone grinding, Stygian Reins. These are all going to be great. Flip-flopping back, we have Immaculate Mount as a new spell added recently, which is going to buff up the magic resistance of your cavalry, and maybe make the game less harsh to them as it was when I played. Magic Duel is always going to be really, really good for your nation because you do have such cheap any-for astral mages. And Invulnerability and Soul Vortex are there because your Witch Kings can actually use these really well to either solo thug or to do really crazy magic things if you give them some regenerating bodyguards. For the Pretender design, overall I want to rate Order and Magic really highly here, as your nation does feature a lot of cavalry and really good researchers. I think that there's about 3 different varieties of Pretenders you can do with them, which is pretty cool. I think you can go for a very heavy Cavalry Bless for your Orpata to make them strong. That's going to be a very early game focused build. You can definitely take a Dormant Titan, and this is actually what I chose to do, because I feel like it's a middle ground of it lets your cavalry expand, it gives you good scales, and it gives you something to fight off whatever shenanigans other players might use. And finally, you can eschew all of that and just go full scales, full greed, because the more gold you have, the more mages you have, the more mages you have, the more research, and then the faster you get to your really good summons, really good spells, and everything else is just helping you get there. For the gameplay of Sauromatia, early game, don't forget that you can foreign recruit cavalry during expansion. The latest patch made this a little tougher by making them plains, farms, and wastes onlys, but that's okay. You can still do it. They have high map move. They'll catch up. Composite archers are really, really strong, so don't sleep on them, or even the poison variety from the capital, or hydras. Hydras are really good. Just be careful with friendly fire. Remember that you don't need a mage to build a lab in your forts. You can just straight up recruit soothsayers, and they will build the lab for you. Awakened Tattoos and Body Ethereal are fantastic early game spells to buff up your cavalry as long as the enemy doesn't have magic weapons. And kind of remember that early death magic doesn't mix well with cavalry because the rider and the mount have low magic resistance, and often they will outpace the skeletons anyways. So I would personally lean more on astral nature and maybe even water magic early on. As you transition to the mid game, make sure you are sight searching heavily into death and nature magic. At least nature 3 and death 3 in all of your provinces, because you will need a lot of summons. Abuse tight rein where you can, it's very strong. Be super creative here. This is one of the coolest features, I guess, of the nation, right? And remember, you can craft command boosting items to help this. And again, here in the mid game, your cavalry is still really good, but you want to start adding some summons to your armies. A neat trick is if you find Zots somewhere in like an indie cave or something, they can actually lead the Shade Beast around. It's a great combination. And also, start your blood economy here. Your goal is to have every single one of your Blood 1 mages using a Dowsing Rod and a Blood Thorn to Blood Hunt, effectively making them Blood 3. And finally, in the late game, transition almost entirely out of cavalry for your main army. You can still use them to raid, just not for major engagements. You can look at the Winds of Death video for an example of why I'm so focused on this, right? Now, find a use for all of your gems, either empower or trade, break into every magic path as you can. Don't forget you can use crazy spells like White's, like Rigor Mortis, if you have armies of a lot of undead. And you can use anti-magic to actually help your mages resist Rigor Mortis, and they can actually fight while it's going on as well. Legion of Whites is a very efficient army-making spell, and it's only a little bit past Well of Misery, which you should definitely be gunning for anyways, so keep that in mind. And then now is about the time you're going to start using that blood economy you started in the mid-game to supplement your armies. It's definitely not going to be as good a blood economy as, say, like Mictlan, but it's definitely useful if you have vampires, lifeline protections, or demons. And so that will conclude our Sauromatia at a glance. I am a little out of practice, so maybe it wasn't as concise as some of the other videos were. Hopefully I can keep working on that in the near future. Thank you again all for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And a little fun tidbit is I did actually play these guys through a long-form game, and that's why maybe some more of my opinions were less theoretical and more, hey, this is what I encountered, and, you know, this was the result, or this was my opinion after it. I hope that's okay. I'll see you guys for the next one. Thank you.